So we are going to try to finish up cases using our screencast technology for a remote class. So let's dive in and continue the discussion on citators. You have investigated the two Lexis Learn modules on citing good law as well as finding more authority. So let's see how we do that on Westlaw. And just as a reminder, the links that we will be talking about on the free web are, as always, in our class web links under cases. So we're going to take a look at a slightly different case on Westlaw, the Rush Prudential case. This is actually a case relevant to our HMO liability question. So you may have run into this or recognize it from our various searches. And what you will notice here is the Rush Prudential case. First of all, we always want to make sure we know what court we're in, Supreme Court, so that is going to be authoritative for every jurisdiction. And of course, you want to check out the signal. Signals look a little different on Westlaw, of course. We've got the flags. And notice here for Rush Prudential, we have a yellow flag, but it tells us that overruling is recognized by. Let's just take a quick look at Lexis by way of contrast. Notice the same case, Rush Prudential, has a red stop sign. Again, this is, I think, a really good reminder that you are not determining whether your case is good law. As you learned in the Lexis modules, we are determining whether various holdings are good law. So Lexis Shepherds made a different determination as the overall status, but there are various different holdings in Rush Prudential. So at least one of them was overruled, but several of them may not have been, as may be what's signified by this yellow flag. But notice that the explanation tells us overruling recognized by. So we know that Rush Prudential has some serious question about the validity of at least one, if not more, of its holdings. Okay, let's take another look at the case itself in Rush Prudential, because as we saw in the second Lexis Learn module, you can use the Shepherdize this headnote function to find other cases that talk about Rush Prudential, but for a particular headnote of Rush Prudential. Of course, Lexis Learn used a different case, but the same concept applies. So here, looking at Rush Prudential, we have the same feature in the headnotes, and it gives us, within each headnote, we get a link to different cases that cite to Rush Prudential for this particular headnote. So for headnote number 2 that covers these two topics, we can find 16 cases that cite to this particular headnote. And of course, we know this is one of interest because we had investigated this earlier, so this might be one way of finding other cases on this particular point of law. But let's now dive into the central part of Westlaw Citator, which is known as Key Cite, and let's take a look at some of the tabs. So first we see the History tab. First, we'll look at the History tab. And this is like that graphical view we saw on Lexis. We see a nice graph explaining that the path of this particular litigation, and we see the case that we entered, which is up here. So we'll notice that there's no subsequent history. There's nothing that happened after this case, as we can see based on this graph, but there's plenty of prior history, what happened leading up to the case we entered. If we had entered this appellate court decision from F3rd, we would see what would be subsequent history would be what happens later, the Supreme Court case, as well as granting cert to get to the Supreme Court case, and the prior history would be what happened before. So keep those distinctions in mind, prior history versus subsequent history. Okay, but of course, where you're going to check about the validity of the various points of law within any particular case on KeyCite is going to be the Negative Treatment tab. And you will see those cases that negatively cite Rush Prudential, 28 of them, and you can see what the treatment is to Rush Prudential of this particular case. So this case recognizes an overruling, and Westlaw even highlights for us there is the most negative case, the plain case, and again the overruling is recognized. Again, you always want to be cognizant of the court that you're in. It's not to say that a lower court is irrelevant. If this lower court is telling us, hey, Rush Prudential was overruled and we're recognizing this other case that, or other circumstance that overruled it, you want to take a look at that for sure. And again, bearing in mind, keeping in mind what your particular point of law, or points of law, plural, that might be of interest. And one way you can see various points of law, again, are through the headnotes. So taking a look, if you know that you are interested in Rush Prudential for headnote number 1, then this case is definitely going to be more relevant for you. You also see these signals of the depth of treatment. This is just telling you how much this particular case, the Glynn case, for instance, discussed Rush Prudential a great deal because it's got 4 bars, whereas Clay didn't discuss it quite as much with only the 2. To see all of the cases, as well as other documents that cited to Rush Prudential, you want to go to the Citing References tab. And in the Citing References tab, you can narrow by different types of documents. So, of course, we'll take a look at cases first. And you do want to narrow to the particular type of document because that allows you to use the various filters. So if we're seeing, well, wait a minute, are there any cases that follow Rush Prudential? Maybe I have a point of law that was not overruled. I can narrow by our jurisdiction, as you can see here, as we have used many times. If I want to narrow Rush Prudential by a headnote, I can do that using the headnote links here, and again, just click on Specify, and I can look at the various types, or specific headnotes rather. So we know we're interested in healthcare benefits, so maybe I want to choose headnote 2. And we can filter results that way. But of course, there are other types of materials we can limit by. If we're confused about what in Rush Prudential was overruled and what wasn't, maybe a secondary source can help us. So these are secondary sources that definitely cite to Rush Prudential. And again, we can choose which type we like. So if you want to take a law review and hope that a law review author is going to discuss Rush Prudential in more depth, that might not be a bad approach to take. And you can even see the particular headnotes in Rush Prudential that that particular secondary source discusses, which is actually kind of cool. And just moving across the tabs, we have a table of authorities, and this works just the same way as it did, as it was explained in the Lexis Learn modules. So we can see the various cases that Rush Prudential cited and see the status of those cases. If Rush Prudential relied upon a particular case that was overruled by a later case, you might want to know that. If that is relevant to your issue and your point of law that you need to research. And last, I want to point out, which is also available on Lexis, the videos didn't point it out, but it works pretty much the same way. Sometimes it's useful to set up a key cite or a shepherd's alert. If you are following a particular case, and you want to know, is anybody going to appeal this, or this case has been appealed, what's going to happen? You can set up an alert using the little bell signal. And last but not least on KeyCite, I want to just refresh your memory that you can use KeyCite for more than just cases. A lot of people forget that. Oops, my mistake. Let's put in a section number there. So our good old section 1144. And again, just to highlight, these are essentially KeyCite tabs. We talked about the flags already, just proposed. But again, just to refresh your memory, notes of decisions will discuss section 1144 in some amount of depth. And notes of decisions will also give you topics that So you can narrow your searches to cases that discuss a particular topic with regard to 1144. Citing references will just mention 1144. There'll be cases, but you can also find other types of material as well, just as we did with citing references in our case. Okay, let's move on in our discussion of citators to Bloomberg. And we all know how much everybody loves Bloomberg. But as it turns out, Bloomberg isn't so bad. If you have a particular case and you need to know what the validity of a particular holding in that case, I would say the advantage to Bloomberg is it's relatively simple. You have positive, distinguished, negative. You don't have a whole long list to figure out what exactly does this particular treatment mean. Bloomberg gives you the overall status up here, so you have the nice simple color coding. So I think as a citator, Bloomberg would not be a bad option to choose. And again, we have the treatments. We can look at the history. We can look at the analysis. So again, we see the cases listed. We can narrow by particular treatment. So there are some, Bloomberg's citator called bcite does have some sophistication. Unfortunately, as with the rest of Bloomberg, it does not have the search within results feature, which of course, as we saw with Lexis, is very important. And I should highlight as we go back to Westlaw, since I neglected to show you that. Going back, so here I'll just go to the negative treatment tab in our Russian Prudential case. Actually, that was a bad example. Let's go to citing references. Again, citing references is where you'll be able to use the filters, and one of the filters is search within results. So if we go to cases, we can view negative, we could use search within results, we could do all those different combination of filters as you saw on Lexis Learn. But as we said, unfortunately, no search within results on Bloomberg, but it does give you a nice, straightforward representation of the history and the citing cases, as well as what those how those cases cited to Rush Prudential. And similarly, on Bloomberg, we do have table of authorities. Again, works the same way as we saw on Lexis and on Westlaw. And the citing documents is just the tab separated out for secondary sources and other types of documents that cite to Rush Prudential. So you can see we have a nice list of some secondary sources, books, portfolios, annuals, so different secondary materials that cite to your case on Bloomberg. Okay, we are now done with citators, and we are going to take a look at some free sources on which to find cases. And of course, there's our good friend Google Scholar. We took a brief look at Google Scholar when we first started talking about cases, so just as a quick review, get to Google Scholar by Googling Google Scholar, and then just remember this button here to go to case law rather than the articles, and then you can do your search. And I would say, as far as free websites, Google Scholar for cases, Google Scholar is going to be the best one to go to when you just want to do a keyword search. As we know, Google is excellent at that. So if I need to just do keyword search and I want to do a quick search for free, Google Scholar is where I would start. You can see I did a quick search for our liability health maintenance organization, and sure enough, Rush Prudential comes up. Now the site Google Scholar, in addition to being a free source for cases, also has its own citator. And it calls it how cited, but if you ask me, that's not named properly because it basically just tells you what cases cited to rush prudential. It does not tell you how those cases cite to rush prudential. So as you can see, we just have a list here of many different cases that cite to rush prudential, but I don't know if they followed. I don't know if they overruled. Looking at Google Scholar, I cannot tell whether any of the points of law, any of the holdings in rush prudential are good law. So Google Scholar is definitely not a complete substitute for Westlaw because it doesn't have that treatment, but it does at least get us started. And again, a great place if you already know a name of a case, you just want to read it, or a good place just to do a quick search, just as we did with our liability health maintenance organization. There are other sources, and we already are getting to know these sources for free sources, free websites for sources of the law. And here again, have the Legal Information Institute. I happen to think a really excellent source. Legal Information Institute, here's the home page again. Get the Law will get us to jurisdictions. We can go to federal or state. I probably wouldn't use LII to do a keyword search. If I had a particular case or I wanted to get to a particular jurisdiction's courts to look at what cases they have available, that's how I would use LII. In fact, what I typically do use LII for is when I know I need a particular case in a particular state court, so this is how I get to those state courts. So we'll use a different example for California, because it's at the top of the list. And as you can see, it divides it up by branch, and I can go to particular courts. I can search California for opinions. Now notice we are going to a California site. So again, LII is a good portal to get me to other websites that might have opinions. FindLaw is another resource we have talked about and you might have used. Notice when we just go to regular old FindLaw, if you Google it, it's going to bring you to the public site. You need to remember up here to visit, because we are legal professionals, so we want to go to the professional site. And it does give us some ability to do some searching. Again, this would be for a specific case. Again, one technique I like to use for exploring a less familiar website is check out their advanced search. And in their advanced search, again, I can specify a court. I can at least get to a legal topic, so I can do some subject searching, not as in-depth as Google Scholar and certainly not Lexis and Westlaw. I even have the ability to do this full text search. Again, I'm not going to expect that to be wonderful, but if I just want to spend a few minutes to get started, again, I wouldn't spend a lot of time. I would use FindLaw mostly to find already identified known cases. And then as we started to see when we looked at Legal Information Institute, especially for state cases, although it's true for federal courts as well, but especially for state cases, you may want to go to that particular state's jurisdiction. LII gave us links how to get there, or of course there's always Google, which works just fine too. So if you were to Google New York courts, you would probably get to this page here. And if I wanted to investigate decisions, again, most of the time, 95% of the time, it would be when I already know about the case, a specific case, whether I have its name or hopefully its citation as well. And then you see here, and every state's going to be organized and look tremendously different. So here's the decisions link. That doesn't really tell us very much. Again, I could go to specific courts, and here I would probably take a look at the official reports in New York. So we have been to this Law Reporting Bureau site before. This opinions site gives us a couple of different choices. Remember, we spoke about, we're not seeing the full, here's the full, what the full page looks like. Remember, we spoke about slip opinions back in the old days when they came out, and cases came out in paper. They first came out in these tiny little pieces of paper that were known as slip opinions. Well, they still use that term, which is why we mention it. So if we wanted to search for very recent cases. We go to slip opinions, and again, you can see it divides up by the different courts in New York. So we're interested in the second department since that's where we are. Notice we also have motions, which would be interesting to look at too. Just lists the different cases, most recent first. I can go back pretty far, so it isn't just the most recent cases, but this would be one way to find either decisions or motions. This was also a site, another part of the site where we could find unreported cases. So let's go back to our, and this is official reports, so these would not be unreported. And notice this brings us to a Westlaw site. What the New York State courts have done is contract out with Westlaw to give some searchability. So notice we have some word searching capability for the New York official reports. And last but not least on our New York site, let's go back here to our official reports site and this resources link. This resources link also gives us resources for citation services. So we actually have a little bit of a citator. Again, it's more of like a Google Scholar citator. So if we wanted to look at the New York Official Reports Citator Service, we would have to have some information about the case. Obviously, is what you do when you're using a citator for a case. So if we put in a sample search so you can see what it looks like, here's People v. Hunter. And what we see are the different cases that cite to People v. Hunter. We have no idea how they cite to People v. Hunter. Overrule, reverse, distinguish, questioned, who knows? But here are cases that cite to People v. Hunter. So again, a bare bones citator service like we saw on Google Scholar. Now, we've been spending some amount of time throughout the course, I hate to say, not being very complimentary of Bloomberg, and with good reason, I think. But here is the reason that you want to know about Bloomberg. What Bloomberg does far better than any other service I know about anyway, is allows us to look at dockets. Now, dockets, of course, are the files of all of the different parts of litigation. If you'll forgive me, I kind of think of it as the legislative history of an opinion. So you have the opinion, but all of the documents that led up to the opinion. So originally in court you file a complaint, and then the defendant files an answer. There may be various motions. There will be briefs, possibly, eventually. There may be some court transcripts. What a docket does is gather all of those materials, all of those documents for a case. And a lot of times, certainly if you're involved in litigation, you want to keep track of the docket. A lot of times it's useful to go back and look at somebody else's brief on a particular subject and see what they had to say, or see how a complaint is drafted. So dockets can be good for looking at forms of pleadings to see how it's supposed to look in your jurisdiction. And the reason Bloomberg is so good is Bloomberg contracted out with the federal court system called PACER. Now, you can search PACER by itself, but you'll have to trust me, it's pretty difficult and not at all user-friendly. So what Bloomberg did is it contracted with PACER, so it gets all of PACER's information, and then it makes it look much easier to use. And in addition to PACER, which as I mentioned is only federal courts, Bloomberg also has a fair number of state courts. Not as complete as the federal, but Bloomberg will be the first place I go to look for a docket. If I'm looking for a complaint, if I'm looking for the status of a particular case. So since you know you are looking for a particular case, you will hopefully know your court. So it's usually good if you can to narrow to that particular court. So I'm going to look for a case having to do with Led Zeppelin. And for those of you who aren't familiar with their most famous song, Stairway to Heaven, Google it. There are some people in this world who think it is the best classic rock and roll song ever. So let's investigate, and this case actually involving Led Zeppelin has to do with the song Stairway to Heaven. So if I know that this case is in the Central District of California, I'm going to use the drop down to choose that. And honestly, even when I have the docket number, which is just the numbering system that different courts use, I typically don't use it in Bloomberg because you have to guess the format. Do they use colons? Do they use dashes? Do they use zeros? And so the searching is pretty hit or miss with the docket, but typically you do know the party's name, and especially when the name is pretty unusual, like Led Zeppelin, it should be fairly easy to find. So we've narrowed our court, we've entered in our party, as you can see here, and we're just going to scroll down to search. And sure enough, up comes a case from a couple of years ago, not quite. So let's take a look at what a docket looks like. So it gives you all of the information and it tells us the status closed. So this case is no longer active. And I should mention the other totally amazingly great thing about Bloomberg, and I bet you never thought you'd hear those words in the same sentence. Bloomberg not only gives you the docket, it gives you access to the documents themselves. So this is a classic, but wait, there's more, late night TV commercial. You can see the complaint if you so choose. And as we go through, you'll see the different events within the docket. Kind of interesting. So we have summons, we have affidavits, and again, you can view most of these. Now, that's not going to be true for every single case. Some cases are closed, so you can't view their documents. Now, we can see ultimately, if we scroll all the way, a lot went on in this case. At the end here, 300 something documents here. So whatever happened in this case, there was a notice of appeal to the Ninth Circuit. So we might want to now research the Ninth Circuit. Remember, we limited our court to the federal district. So if we limited to Ninth Circuit and searched Led Zeppelin, we could find out what was going on with that case. If it's still going on, if it's been settled, decided, etc. So again, Bloomberg, totally the best place for documents. If you don't have Bloomberg, which may be the case, then I would say go to the court first. I would go to the federal court, the state court, and see what you can find. Honestly, what you find on Westlaw and Lexis, and you see links for dockets, even on their very front page here, they are very hit or miss, and rarely do you get access to the actual documents, the actual complaints, and so forth. One free source for state courts, a free source for dockets are going to be the state court websites themselves. Likewise, for the federal courts, there is one other source, an organization called RECAP has tried to gather documents that people all over the country have downloaded to Pacer. So you can try visiting their archive and seeing if you can find what you need there, and they will have some of the documents, but again, it's very hit or miss. So if you have access to Bloomberg, go to Bloomberg. If not, the court website or RECAP. And then if you really have to, that's a Westlaw. So another aspect of cases are the oral arguments, especially in the Supreme Court. There are lots of interesting oral arguments, and you can actually get audio, MP3 versions of these oral arguments from the Supreme Court at this site called Oyez, and you can do that also at the New York Court of Appeals. You can see that there are access to their webcast. So if you're interested in hearing oral arguments, this is one way to do that. You can also find transcripts at these sites as well. So you see here in the Court of Appeals, and there's transcripts available in the Oyez site as well. Okay, so that is going to be the end of part 1 of our makeup class. Make sure you answer the think questions, and make sure you also view part 2, which will cover the remaining aspects of litigation.